Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to do part 2 of the Acura Legend brake caliper upgrade. We're going to see if the installation of this is really difficult or if it's pretty straightforward. We do have the supplied hardware for the Legend on both calipers. In the previous video you noticed that the calipers, one was purchased remanufactured and the other one was purchased through a salvage yard. And we took the parts out of it to rebuild the one from the salvage yard, because you can't buy a left anymore, you can only buy right in the remanufactured world. So today we're going to install both of these, go over the installation process. As I understand, it's pretty straightforward, and then we'll take it out on the road and we'll see how it feels in comparison to the stock single piston calipers that come on the CL Type S. And I'll give my opinion on whether or not it's worth a good investment. People have said that this upgrade also resolves the issue where you have vibration under heavy braking from the single piston caliper. There's apparently some slight rotor warpage that can occur, which is just buildup of extra pad material or uneven pad material. A lot of people said that that is pretty much resolved with this. I haven't noticed that in the couple thousand miles that I've used the single piston caliper post the upgrade where we put on centric OEM style brakes. So it would be interesting to see if that indeed becomes an issue or not with this upgrade. The other thing is the installation of new hardware. We'll see if the new hardware actually fits the existing caliper bracket, because this is a caliper only. We're going to reutilize the OEM bracket for the CL. And we'll see if this hardware bracket kit actually fits, and if you get more bang for your buck, so to speak, by purchasing two remanufactured ones and using the supplied hardware. So let's get to it. So the first place we're going to start with is putting in some fluid into the calipers itself. That will eliminate the air that's already in the caliper, because we're going to bleed the air out of these. That's how you get them to function. So they come with this supplied bolt in the back of them, and what we're going to do is take our brake fluid and just gently pour it into the hole here. That way there's not as much of a void to fill. Now, since it is brake fluid, we're going to want to clean this up so that it doesn't erode the paint, because brake fluid will erode and decay the brake paint that's on here. And how we do that, it's pretty simple. Some brake cleaner. ready to go ahead and install them. For this job, you really don't need a lot of tools. You'll need a couple spanners or wrenches, as well as maybe some sockets, just to get the hoses off and the brackets. Other than that, it's a pretty straightforward job. What I'm going to do to minimize the leakage of brake fluid is go ahead and remove the caliper, hang it off to the side. That way I can work on the guide pins on the caliper to see if, in fact, that they can be replaced with the supplied hardware. Other than that, it's going to be essentially just a swap out of the caliper. Your pads and your brackets with the pads all stay. You don't have to swap those out, and actually you can't really swap those out. So it's essentially just a line disconnect and a new caliper install. So let's go ahead and get started on this. Okay, so that's a 14 for your guide pins. You can see that this caliper has considerable rust on it. This is the factory OEM. It's about 20 years old now at this point. So, the fact that we're replacing this is probably a good thing, because at some point we would have to remanufacture this anyways. Also gives us a chance to look at our slide pins. And it looks like we have a partially seized one on the bottom. That's never good. Yeah, grease is pretty dried up on that one. So now let's get the new bracket and boots and see if they actually fit. So they definitely look like they could work. So we're gonna give it a shot. Let's see if the boots compare. So here's our two pins. Obviously, this is aftermarket pin versus OEM pin, so they're gonna have definite differences in them. But for the most part, it looks like they are the same diameter as well as the same length. So that will allow us to swap out the slide pins for new slide pins. Now we're going to see if the boot is replaceable and interchangeable here. I would say, yep, they look pretty comparable to each other, so we're going to try using the new boot as well. Okay, so now we have the new boots installed for the guide pins. It's time to install our slide pins. You always want to use silicone paste. You never want to use a petroleum-based lubricant for these pins, because it will swell the rubber around your boots, and then it'll degrade the boots. So you really just want to put silicone lubricant only. I use 3M. So here we have the Acura Legend caliper mounted to the Acura CL caliper bracket here. So the bracket is the original OEM, and the caliper is an OEM Legend caliper. Now, to install this correctly, you have to actually do it incorrectly. So you have to swap the sides. The left caliper goes on the right side, and the right caliper goes on the left side. Now, the reason for that is because the bleed screw located here has to point up. And the reason why it has to point up is because the air has to expel up. Air rises and is less dense than the brake fluid itself. So if you were to switch the calipers to be orientated the actual way that they're indicated on the caliper, i.e. left on the left and right on the right, then what will happen is the bleed screw will be on the bottom of the caliper, and the air will float up to the top but won't have a way to escape. So what we do here is we switch the caliper sides and we bleed as we normally would with the engine off, pump the brakes, and then open up the bleed screw. So it might help to have a partner to do this part of it. If you're unfamiliar with bleeding brakes, there's plenty of YouTube videos on there. I won't go into depth on how to do that here because this is just an install tutorial for the caliper. But you can see that the original pads and the caliper bracket with the hardware are a good fit for the Legend Caliper here. So it's really just a caliper on and off and corresponding hose disconnecting, reconnect on the new caliper. After that you bleed and now you're good to go. So this video is pretty much a straightforward tutorial for those who are looking for a mild upgrade to their brakes. The dual piston caliper has been noted as resolving a lot of the uneven pad wear that can occur on the rotor here. This is also known as warping the rotor. Warping the rotor doesn't really have anything to do with heat. It has to do with the buildup of friction material on the rotor surface. If the rotor surface has an uneven application of brake material, then what will happen is you get a vibration or a pull sensation in the brake pedal when you go to stop. Now, why does this solve that problem? The reason why this solves that problem is because it applies a more even distributed braking power towards the pad itself and allows the pad to mate to the surface more evenly, and that way you don't get a rippling effect. With a single caliper, it's a larger surface that it has to cover, and it doesn't cover it in an even fashion. It has pressure points at which the caliper will meet the pad, and the pad at that point will have pressure, but it leaves other areas of the pad without pressure. This is then more intensified by the fact that if your caliper pins are not greased, it will have a more uneven wear from that too, and then you get a magnification of the effect, and then a warping of the rotors, and then a pulsing sensation. So the hope is that by having a more even spread of pressure over the pad, that the rotor and the pad will meet at a plane surface or a smooth surface and then apply an even braking pressure. So hopefully this tutorial has helped you in understanding the mild upgrade. So at this point I've taken the car out, I've done my assessment. Unfortunately, it doesn't really make for great media when you're trying to explain braking and driving at the same time. There's really not a lot you can really see. But I thought I'd explain what I mentioned in the last section of the video, which was the uneven pad buildup of material on the rotor surface. So in a floating piston setup, you have pistons on one side. And specifically on the CL, you have one piston on one side of the pads or on the caliper applying pressure. And as you can see, you have pressure points within that pad so that when you're pressing on the brakes, the piston extends into the pads and you have one point of contact, which is just the single piston applying pressure on the back side of the pads. What happens with that is that the pad actually flexes because it's a metal surface on a metal surface, and the pressure of the brakes being applied causes that metal to slightly deform and then allows an uneven buildup of material on the rotors. In the Legend, you have two pistons applying a more evenly spread amount of pressure over that pad surface, and that allows for the pad to mate more precisely and evenly with the rotors, and then reduces the likelihood of warping. So the question that we were trying to answer in our installation was, is the Legend Caliper setup an upgrade over the single piston CL? The notion being that two pistons are better than one, two pistons is a performance upgrade versus a single piston setup, and you're going to notice a difference with the Legend setup. Due to the design of the calipers being both floating, and that the fact that the Legend actually isn't a bigger setup, meaning that you're running bigger pads, it's really not a noticeable or appreciative difference between the two setups. What this actually allows for is a more even pressure across the brake pads, as we said, which in turn may have some effect on performance, but you don't notice it while you're driving, at least I haven't. Under extreme braking, I didn't really notice more bite, I didn't notice a shorter stopping distance. So what you may notice is longer pad life and longer rotor life, but you're not going to have a performance experience like you would with a Brembo setup where you have pistons on both sides of the caliper clamping on the pads and subsequently clamping on the rotors, which gives you a stronger force and a more a stronger bite experience. If you're looking for a performance setup, then maybe the RL or the third gen Acura TL Type S 6-speed Brembo setup is the route that you want to go, or something in the aftermarket world. So, is it worth the money? If you're at the point where you're going to replace calipers anyways, then yes. The only problem is that the Legend calipers are becoming harder to come by. They've been kind of sought after as this OEM Plus upgrade. Unfortunately, you're not really getting what most people think that they are paying for. So, would you upgrade to the Legend? Maybe. If you're an enthusiast and you don't want to go the full track route experience or Brembo setup and you need to replace your calipers, they can be a good alternative option for you, assuming you can find them and assuming that you have the ability and the tools necessary to rebuild them, because most of them are going to need to be rebuilt at this point. We've already talked about how the Legend caliper is only available in the remanufactured market on one side, and so you have to source the other side from a junk or salvage yard. The CL caliper has been noted as a more prone setup to warpage, so you may want to go that route if you want to avoid that. With that being said, we needed to upgrade the calipers on this because the calipers were so bad that the casting had actually cracked, and that is a safety concern, and so I opted to go with the Legend setup. It maintains that OEM appearance without having to really venture into the performance brake caliper setup where you're spending more money, and this car isn't going to be on the track, so it's completely unnecessary for me. But I did want to at least give it some of an upgrade and also maintain that OEM look. So the Legend caliper setup worked well for me. Now, depending on where you are on that spectrum, you may opt to go with just original caliper replacement. If you're looking for a little bit of an OEM Plus upgrade, the Legend is a great option if you can find it. And then lastly, if you're looking for a track experience setup, then the Brembo setup is where you want to be. So hopefully that explains it, and hopefully that answers the question, is it worth it? Depending on where you are, it may be or it may not be worth it.
So I wanted to include a picture of the original equipment caliper here so you could see why it was necessary to replace it. The Legend caliper, like I said, was an option for me, and I went ahead and included it for the car because of the necessity behind needing to replace the original calipers. In the original caliper picture here, you can see that the casting of the caliper has considerable deterioration and cracking occurring. The metal itself is so fatigued that under extreme pressure, heat, and stopping force, it's possible that this could have cracked altogether, and then the braking safety that you desire in a car then goes away, right? So because of this extreme metal fatigue here shown in the picture, it was really necessary to replace those calipers.